Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Senior Home Companions podcast. It is Kirsten McCarthy here, Marketing Coordinator with SHC. Today, we are going to be discussing the statistical and anecdotal findings regarding socialization in seniors and looking at it from a wellness perspective. We are joined today by Chuck Gillespie, a veteran of wellness workplace management and social impact organizations for over 25 years. Chuck, would you mind explaining your background and introducing yourself?
Yeah, hi, Kirsten, and thank you very much for the time today. Again, Chuck Gillespie. I have spent my first part of my career in the HR space. When I was HR manager at one of my very first organizations, it was a public utility. I got this thing called wellness added to my list of things that I was supposed to be doing. So one of the things I've always had a good luck of is the fact that during that period of time when I got this new assignment as the HR manager, it reminded me that my sister was actually the director of wellness for the Savannah Riverside for the Department of Defense. So I'm like, I'll just call her and find out what the heck I'm supposed to be doing with this thing. I moved into another position, a director of HR for a large trucking and transportation company. And in my interview during that period of time, the CEO that I was reporting to asked me, what did I want to do in my first 90 days? And I was like, we're going to set up a culture of wellness and well-being so that our people really understand the culture that we've already developed here at the organization so that we can take it and move it to the next level. And what we saw in that period of time was reduction in our total turnover, reduction in our total costs of hire, increases in our tenure of our folks that are actually working there in a very short period of time, in about just a year and a half of installing just a very simple, basic concept of wellness and well-being. Now, I want to start by also understanding exactly how I identify wellness and well-being. Wellness is actually functioning optimally within your current environment. So when you think about it, don't think about wellness as fitness. Don't necessarily think about it as mental health. Don't necessarily think about it as, any other of the factors that you hear that term wellness being used over and over of time. Think about it from that whole concept of functioning optimally within the current environment. When we talk about that, that means that we're trying to make sure that people are physically, mentally, and emotionally healthy. It is all things, and that's really the whole impact of what you're going to do. Now, moving forward, I actually spent almost 15 years working as a Wellness Association leader. I was the head of wellness for the Indiana Chamber of Commerce, the Wellness Council of Indiana within there, and then I spent 5 years as the CEO of the National Wellness Institute. In that period of time, my sister, who I was talking about just before that, spent 16 years, almost 20 really, as the professor of wellness management at Ball State University. So the two of us have been collaborating together in that space for nearly two decades. So know that this is something that I've spent a lot of time, a lot of energy on. And what's really great is we've talked about it not only from the workplace and the community perspective, but we have talked about it specifically about senior living and the whole aspect of how we can create these wonderful cultures of environment for our seniors to live a life worth living.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, Chuck, you have an incredible background, and we're just so honored to get the chance to talk to you today. I know that you have so much knowledge to give all of our listeners, and specifically leaning into the senior industry and how you've seen that in the wellness industry. We're going to be diving into isolation and loneliness in seniors. And can you kind of tell us why this is such a huge issue for seniors?
Absolutely. And let me start by explaining how I view social isolation and loneliness and the differences between the two. Social isolation is not having contact with people. Now, let's remind ourselves, there are people in this world that don't want to have social contact. Totally respect those folks. That is such a small percentage of our population that we've got to identify the fact that is a unique individual. We have got to have people that are connected with people, have relationships with people, support from others. And in a lot of ways, that's where a lot of the senior living and the senior, opportunities are, whether you're in a living space, whether you're at home, you still have to have that support network. And again, I'll talk about it from my own mother-in-law's perspective and my mother's perspective, and knowing that that's why both of them had a good life worth living. But my mother-in-law, who had a lot more of a social isolation situation, simply because her husband had passed away almost 15 years ago, and then she moved from her hometown of 40 years to near where my wife and I live. She didn't really have any other family and friends other than my wife and I, and a cousin that was truly connected to her. So she became very socially isolated, and that loneliness was seen from that perspective. Conversely, my mother, who grew up in a small town in southern Indiana, she and my dad were the only two from both sides of their family that left the town. They retired, moved back there. They've been there for 35 years. My mom had my father, my sisters and I, my aunts, my uncles, my cousins, and other family members and other friends that they've grown up with all their lives around her all the time. My mom was wheelchair bound for about 10 years before she passed. But my dad was the person that went out there, and he went out and bought the nicest wheelchair. He bought the van. And so when she was put in a senior living facility, he would still go in 2-3 times. He'd go in 2-3 times a day, but even 2-3 times a week, he would grab her, throw her in the wheelchair, throw her in the van, take her out to Chick-fil-A for lunch, or take her back home for a little while.
Yeah.
And you saw that my mom was constantly with people and had that support network. My mother-in-law, on the other hand, she went into this senior living facility right during COVID. So not only was she lonely and isolated because she was moving to a brand new place, but even my wife and I couldn't come and see her and give her a hug. Yeah. Or even just that simple thing. We communicated with her all the time on the phone, and we did stop by when we could. But that was really, and we saw my mother-in-law's dementia really kick in hard. And it probably, as a result of that loneliness and isolation, her dementia probably went beyond and quicker than what she would have had she not had that social support, that network, that group of folks beyond even my wife and I and my mom, my mother-in-law's cousin. Yeah. That we could only be there so many times.
Right. And I think it's so interesting just to look at the difference between social isolation and loneliness, because when we think about the two, I think there becomes this gray area of what does that mean. And being in the home care industry, we see this all the time. Yeah. But I think it's so important for the community to know the difference and just different social aspects of that.
Well, there's a statistic out there, and this is not just for senior living. This is for everybody. And again, I'm not going to get the numbers right. I'm not going to get the statistics right. But essentially, only about 1/3 of the population of the United States feel like they have somebody that they can call at 3 o'clock in the morning for an emergency. That's a sad state of affairs. I mean, I'll be the first to tell you, I can think of 5 people in my cul-de-sac that I could call.
I think my list is pretty short too.
Your list might be, but I'm just talking about just my cul-de-sac.
Yeah.
That's not including my family, my friends that live nearby, all these different people. Yeah. But just my cul-de-sac alone, I would have no problems calling any one of them. Yeah. So that's where you really got to start to understand that difference between being isolated and lonely. CDC, the statistics out there is like 1 in 3 adults in the U.S. report feeling lonely, which basically means you could still have all the friends in the world, but you're still lonely. And that's a huge mental health issue. That's where a lot of the suicides really start to kick in. I hate to say it this way, but, think about Robin Williams. Think about that as one of the most beloved individual. And, he ended up committing suicide simply because he felt lonely. And yet that was one of those things to grin. About 1 in 4 adults report not having a social and emotional support. 25%. That's a huge number. And that just exacerbates when we get into the senior living, especially for those folks. Like I said, before my mother-in-law moved here, she was 4.5 hours away. Yeah. So, and my brother-in-law, he lives, at the time he lived in Colorado. He now lives in Canada. So, as much, he tried to get back as much as he could, but it really was up to my wife and myself to really make sure that my mother-in-law was taken care of. Especially as her friend group, I'll say it this way, started to slow down or move to their families or move into senior facilities or pass away.
Yeah.
And again, let me reiterate. My mother-in-law lived to be 87 years old. She had a great life. My mom lived to be 84. She also lived a great life. But I do believe that my mother-in-law's dementia would have absolutely not moved as quickly into her had she been able to be more socially connected and that capabilities. Now, part of it was truly COVID.
Yeah.
And we see the statistics out there. I mean, they're just everywhere about how many people died due to that lack of social impact, that lack of social connection.
Yeah.
So, when you think about it from that perspective and some of the items and the services that your organization is even providing, these are the kind of things that I know my wife and I would have loved to have been able to connect into. And that's really what it's all about, is making sure that if you can't do it, to make sure that you have that ability to find that group and that organization to either supplement what you're doing or help you do it all together.
Yeah. And I think that you said a lot of important things there and created great real life examples. And we see that every day. The kids live out of town. Maybe a spouse has passed away, and there is a lot of social isolation and loneliness involved.
Yeah. And especially as the dementia starts to kick in, I'll just say it this way. My mother-in-law couldn't make phone calls.
Right.
We got her, she couldn't handle her computer anymore. We had to get a very basic remote. You don't have that ability to connect into them unless you have somebody there to even set that up.
Right.
One of my favorite stories, and I'll just say it, and it's very emotional too, but she and her brother were best friends. And he lives in the Boston, Massachusetts area. So I can still remember on one of her last really good days, probably about 4 weeks prior to her passing away, my wife ended up getting on a FaceTime call with him. And my mother-in-law couldn't speak a whole lot at that point in time, but to just hear his voice, and he just kept talking, because he knew that he couldn't have the interaction, but to watch her face light up, and to watch that mother-in-law that I knew and loved come out, and I got to see that one more time. That was what it's all about. And those are the kind of things that we've got to remind ourselves about what's going on. My mother's last full good day was where she had all of her grandkids in front of her. She had everybody but my oldest sister. And it was Easter weekend. And we had a wonderful day. And it was 4 days later that she passed, because she was like, my day is good. I've had a good day. That's what we've got to remind ourselves. This is not anything more than making sure that we're really taking care of those folks and giving them that emotional support. If we can't do it, let's make sure that we have that going on right now.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Chuck, for sharing such a personal and emotional story. I think I'm going to start tearing up, because all of these stories, and I know a lot of our listeners have been through these personal experiences.
Without a doubt.
And it's really just, it's hard to go through that process.
It's never easy.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I remember going back to the senior living facility and thanking, here are the folks that really blew me away.
Yeah. Was
the cafeteria staff that loved my mother-in-law, because she was always just this bundle of joy. One of the folks that did a lot of the cleaning, she came in and she cried with my wife, because she was going to miss my mother-in-law that much.
Yeah. Aww.
The impact that those individuals made on my mother-in-law were huge, and made that transition that much better and that much stronger. And so it's not always the people that you think it's going to be.
Right.
And that's what we've got to remind ourselves. And that's why it is so important to really make sure, especially if you have those means to do so, you've got to make sure that they have those things, because even in the senior living facilities, they do an amazing job, but they're still understaffed, and they're
Right.
never going to be fully staffed. It's just a reality.
Yeah.
But we've got to remind ourselves, and again, that the research is through the roof. If you want the research, go look at Gallup's research on well-being. Jim Harder, who I've got a good relationship with, he's the chief scientist at Gallup. Jim has done so much work in this space, and that's, and it's all about understanding that purpose. What is your purpose in life? For a lot of people, it's during their career days, it's their job, their job. But for a lot of people, you've got to understand, now when you retire, you've got a new job. It's still a job. You just may not get paid what you were before. So we've got to remind ourselves that that's really what we've got to be looking at. The Centers for Disease Control has some amazing information about social impact and loneliness, and I would highly recommend that. One of my absolute favorite statistics, and again, I cannot remember where I found this, and I don't know where it came from, but I know it's a fact, because I actually saw the research at one point in time. If you really want to look at your longevity, anybody that's over the age of 40, the number one way to determine whether or not you're going to have a long life has nothing to do with your physical health. It has everything to do with your social connection, with the people that you interact with daily, weekly, monthly. Anybody over the age of 40, the number one statistic of longevity is your social connectedness.
Wow.
So, and again, we've all seen this. We've all seen the husband and wife that basically have kept each other alive for years. And when one passes, the other one is going to pass very quickly after.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, the cousin who lives here nearby that I was telling you about, that was my mother-in-law's cousin, her mom and dad were that exact thing.
Wow.
They had folks that came into their home. They each took care of each other. Then she passed, and he passed literally a month later.
Wow.
So these are the kind of things that we've got to remind ourselves, and we've got to know that the statistics are there, the research is there, but almost every one of us can point to exactly those kind of stories that I'm telling.
Yeah. And I hear about those stories all the time. When one spouse passes, the other is quick to go, and it is extremely sad, but I just think it hones in on the importance of companionship.
Without a doubt.
Yeah.
And again, it's not an easy journey. Let's just leave it out there. It's not an easy journey. But we've got to remind ourselves how important of a journey that is. And I miss my mom and my mother-in-law every day.
Yeah.
But I also know that they lived a life worth living. And that's what puts the smile on my face. And it reminds me every day that I need to go and make sure that, I'm doing the right things. I love going down and spending time with my dad.
Yeah.
And again, the winter time for my dad is actually one of the hardest times, because he doesn't really have a good hobby in the winter. We've got a farm, we've got a lake, so we spend a lot of time at the farm and the lake, and my dad loves it. He gets on his tractor, gets to go out and just be. He gets to go plant his vegetables. I mean, he'll plant like 6 or 7 rows of corn, and half of them will get eaten by the deer. But it's not about the conclusion of getting the corn per se. Mm-hmm. It's the journey of making it happen, planting it, seeding it, watering it, nurturing it, watching the deer eat it. But that's really what it's all about. So we've got to make sure that we have. He just found a grieving group. And what was great about it is he went for the first time, and then his next door neighbor, whose wife passed away 3 months before my mom, my dad asked him to come along. Now they are getting it. Now he's getting that social connection. That's what we've got to be able to do. And if you can't have that, then what can we do with an organization like yours to be able to add those things in? Because this is what's critical. This is what's important to our society. Another great statistic out there, the happiest people on earth. And this is, again, another Gallup. If you notice, I'm a Gallup nerd. The happiest people on earth are Hispanics. And the reason why, and again, A former colleague of mine, she was on my board of directors of the National Wellness Institute. She always tells the story. She's like, Chuck, when we were happy as Hispanics, we dance. When we were sad, we danced. The whole idea about it was we are going to dance, but we're not dancing alone. We're always dancing together. And when you think about it, culturally speaking, the Hispanics always take care of the elders.
Yeah.
And that's something that we've got to make sure that we continue to emulate as a society. It's something that I absolutely love, the fact that, I get to spend that time with my dad. I get to do those things with him today. And because I know one of these days, that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
At the same time, I'm looking at my daughter who just graduated from college, getting ready to go to professional school in May. And we do a dad-daughter trip every year. My wife and daughter and I are going to New York City this Christmas.
Oh my gosh.
We're doing the Rockettes, and we're doing the whole thing for Christmas.
Yeah.
Now, we're doing it like a couple weeks before Christmas, but the point being is, I want to make sure that we have that, because that is so important. It's what I remember growing up with my parents. My mom came to every sporting event I did. I mean, I still jokingly remember when I was a freshman in high school, as we're teeing off for the golf tournament, and the guy that I was competing against goes, "Who's that lady?" I said, "That's my mom." And he's like, "Your mom's coming?" And I said, "Yeah, where's yours?" I mean, he was confused that my mom was there, and I was confused that his mom wasn't.
Yeah.
And that's something that we've got to remind ourselves. We've got to look at what's going on. We only have so many hours of the day, but we also only have so many hours with our families and our friends. And that's something that we've got to remind ourselves every day. Getting into that senior living space, again, how do we make sure that as we are growing and we are aging in a way where we can live our best lives? But it's also aging, my least favorite term out there right now is aging in place.
Yeah.
But my absolute favorite term is aging in the right place.
I love that.
and I know it's only adding one word, but it's such an important thing. When we age in place, that place may not necessarily be the right place for you. So we've got to make sure that that's what we've got to do, is have that right place to age. And sometimes it's not necessarily the geographic location. It's the social connection, so that we can reduce that loneliness factor that does create things like psychosis, increases the dementia from kicking in a much deeper way. The physical health, the physical and mental well-being that we've got to continue to really gravitate to.
Right.
But I'll also remind everybody that we also have to take care of those who are taking care of our loved ones.
I think that's so important.
It was something that I was actually working on. It's well-being for the caregivers. It was hard, luckily because of what I have done in my life, I was able to really be a huge support network, particularly for my wife, especially in those last few weeks when the dementia was really kicking in hard. So, but to know what I knew was such a huge help for me. I can't imagine going into a situation like that and not necessarily having it. So we've got to make sure that we're also taking care of those folks who are taking care of our people.
Right.
Take care of the caregivers, and we've got to make sure the caregiver support is just as important as care for those folks that we're taking care of.
Yes, I could not agree more. And we do a lot at Senior Home Companions to give back to our caregivers, and from grief groups to outings, we know how important it is.
That's not a surprise.
To take care.
That's not a surprise at all.
Self-care is the best care.
Exactly. But it's also reminding people that some people don't necessarily know what self-care is.
That's very true.
This is, again, going back to that social isolation and loneliness, the statistics. One of the number one issues in social isolation and loneliness, ironically, is type 2 diabetes. Why?
Wow.
We eat our emotions. So we've got to remind ourselves that we've got to do things that are healthy for us to handle and cope with those emotional skills.
Yeah, I think that is very true. We can all pick up a tub of Ben and Jerry's ice cream pretty quickly
Yep.
when we're feeling
And I'm not
emotional.
saying that's not important, but I'm also saying it's also important to maybe take a walk or 5 after that Ben and Jerry's.
I agree. I couldn't agree more. And then I want to hone in on, there's a current estimate out there that says that we have 13.8 million seniors living alone in the United States. What problems have you heard with this tidal wave of lonely seniors, and what are they experiencing?
First, I hate to say it this way, but I can tell you right now, I think that number is low.
Okay.
So I think 13.8 million is probably a low number, especially as we have a baby boom generation
Yes.
that is in that retirement age. When you had 94 million baby boomers, that's why I'm thinking 13.8 is actually a low number.
Yeah.
What are we seeing? It's what we were talking about. It is those physical ailments that just become that much more of a problem, especially when you are alone. Somebody's not there to support you. Why take the pills? Why do this? Why do that? You know, it becomes a crutch more than it becomes a joy.
Yeah.
Getting up out of bed, waking up in the morning and having a purpose. What is that purpose that we're going to do? It just becomes something that you're starting to see. You'll start to see more depression and anxiety. You'll start to see folks that are just worried about nothing because there's nothing to worry about. And I know that sounds really weird to say it that way, but it's really understanding that every morning, each and every one of us has a reason to get up out of bed. What is that reason? Mm-hmm. And for folks who are living alone, especially the seniors who don't necessarily have that job that they're going to, who don't necessarily have, somebody that's going to come and support them,
right,
or hang out with them or play cards with them. Who are they going to take on? Again, running into this with the cousin that I've been telling you about earlier. She's late 70s. She's dealing with some issues. She truly doesn't have a support network outside of my wife and I, again.
Yeah.
So how do we make sure that those things are taken care of? How do we make sure that those things are happening? And that's where, we start to look at that issue of suicides, self-harm, sitting a lot because you don't have anything to do.
Yeah.
That's going to increase that opportunity for heart disease and stroke to really start to kick in. Mm-hmm. So remind ourselves over and over again that, number one, 13.8 million is probably a low number.
Yeah.
Number two, how can we solve that problem? Well, we're not going to solve it because it's too big of a number to solve. But what we can do is affect it positively. One of the best ways to do that is to figure out good ways and better ways to get those folks who are lonely and isolated connected. Whether that is getting them connected to a community center, getting them connected to other aspects of what's going on, or getting them connected to the services that you guys are providing. That's how we do it, because all we're trying to do is give them that best life and that life worth living.
Right.
And if we don't, then we're going to see an early death.
Yeah.
And that's the last thing we want. We want them to live a great life. But living a great life includes that social connection.
It sure does. And I think you touched on so many important things. And I know you kind of already answered. My next question was that research has linked social isolation and loneliness to higher risks of a variety of physical and mental conditions. And I know that we talked about the mental conditions and the diabetes and the dementia. I guess what would be the number one health or mental condition that you see directly related to loneliness?
So this sounds, I've talked about this so many times. When I was in the workplace wellness space, we learned really quickly that the number one health risk for most people was anxiety. Mm-hmm. The number one anxiety during your working life is your financial well-being. So if you really wanted to actually fix some of the health risks that you're dealing with, make sure that you have a good financial wellness program presenting to your people.
Yeah.
Now, As you get out of that job, it is really, especially as you get into that senior space, you still have some issues with money because, you may be living on a pension or you may be living on Social Security only.
Yeah.
So you might not have that financial stability that some people do. Most people don't. Unfortunately, we don't have enough people with enough retirement today to be able to handle that. That's a whole another 2 hours that we can go into. We don't have time today. But as we get into that senior space, as we get into that senior living, their number one health risk is that social connectivity. Number one.
Yeah.
There's really, I hate to say it this way, there's really not a number two.
Yeah.
Yes, they may have some cancer issues. Yes, they may have some diabetes issues. Yes, they may have a lot of these depression and anxiety. But I can tell you right now, if you support them socially, many of those things will either be less of a problem, or they'll manage it better, or they may not even go into those health risks associated with those chronic diseases. So understand how important that social connectivity really is. It is not something that we spend a lot of time and energy doing. As a matter of fact, going back to Gallup, going back to Jim Harder, I remember talking to him one time, and I said, Jim, what according to Gallup, the number one way of being well-being is your purpose, your career. And I totally respected that. I said, but how do we get our purpose in our career? Yeah. 75% of people that get their jobs get it through their social network. So isn't social network actually, or social well-being, maybe even your number one choice as opposed to the career? Because that's actually where you're going to get that. And I actually made the chief scientist researcher for Gallup think for 10 seconds before he could answer, that makes a lot of good sense, but the data still says, career and purpose.
No, that's a great point.
But that's what we've got to understand. We've got to handle the physical elements. But if you've got the social connection and they actually feel like they want to succeed and survive, they will. My mom had lung cancer in 1999. April of 1999 was when she was diagnosed. She had a 5, maybe 6% chance of survival. Wow. She lived to be 84.
Wow.
25 years later is when she finally passed away. So know that, and why? Because she's a fighter. She had a social network. Her family, her friends, and her society made her want to do that. So know that it can be done. But we've got to make sure that we understand that it is the people around us. It is that connectivity. It is those people. It is that family, those friends, those folks that work for them. That's where the connectivity goes.
Yeah, that's so important. And then I wanna move into this quote from Dr. Cole. He said that the biology of loneliness can accelerate the buildup of plaque in arteries, help cancer cells grow and spread, and promote inflammation in the brain, leading to Alzheimer's disease. And loneliness promotes several different types of wear and tear on the body. And I just think this is so interesting. What loneliness can actually physically do to our body.
And we don't give it enough time and credit. I don't know what to say to that except, yeah. I mean, I hate to say it that way, but it's just, that's the reality of what it is. Remind ourselves, when we get anxious, how do we breathe? We breathe differently. How do we act? We act differently. Our systems start to fight each other. Think about all that, your gut health. We can put as many probiotics in our systems as we possibly can, but if you're so anxious that you can't, for lack of a better term, go, that's what's going to start causing a lot of these buildups. You got to remind yourselves about what's important. And sometimes we get too emotionally attached or detached to various aspects of what's going on because it's not going our way or we don't like what's happening here, and we take that too personally. Now, we're going to take things personally, let's not lie.
Right.
But that's what stress will do to us. And stress and loneliness and isolation just make it worse.
Right.
And that's what we got to remind ourselves. What a great quote.
Yeah, I I just think that's such an interesting thing to talk about. And I also want to move into another really great quote I heard from Attorney General Vivek Murthy. He's a U.S.
Surgeon General.
Surgeon General,
Dr.
yes.
Murthy, good man, by the way. Big fan of his.
Oh, amazing. He said that the health and societal impacts of social isolation and loneliness are a critical public health concern.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And the previous Surgeon General, Dr. Jerome Adams, who's actually from here in Indiana, who's a good friend of mine. Jerome even talked about it he talked about community health for economic prosperity. So taking Dr. Murthy's quote and Dr. Adams's quotes and kind of slamming them together, it goes back to your sense of community. Where is that sense of community? That sense of community comes from in your home, in your neighborhood, in your city or town, in your state, in your nation, and in your world. Going back to Gallup will tell you the number one, your biggest health risks are within a 1 mile radius of your home. So think about what's around your house. And do you have your friends and family nearby? Right. As I talked about earlier, my cul-de-sac alone, and by the way, there's only about 5 houses, so I can name every single person that lives on that cul-de-sac. Mm-hmm. And we have our Christmas gathering coming up that we do every year.
Oh, that's
so
fun.
That's something that's very unique in what we've got. But we've got to remind ourselves that's what we've got to make sure that we have. When people feel out of their element, that's when the social isolation and the loneliness kicks in. So Dr. Murthy's done a great job as Surgeon General. Dr. Adams did a great job as Surgeon General. I'm very impressed with both of them.
Well, Chuck, I have to say I'm impressed with you. You've just created such a great conversation today, and you really keyed in on so many really important topics. I think our listeners definitely gained so much knowledge from this. I know that I did. But that's all the questions that I had for you today.
Well, hopefully everybody enjoys this, and feel free if you ever want to reach out to me, go through Kirsten here, and I'm happy to have any kind of conversations.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for being here again, Chuck. It's been such a great conversation, and we will see you again on the Senior Home Companions podcast.